Good day everyone and welcome back to another session of the Identity 15 video series organized by WSO2 where we are discussing IAM concepts under 15 minutes. But fair warning, today's episode may take a little longer than that, but I will try to keep it short as possible. So today we are going to look at how to use Asgardeo Android SDK for app native authentication. So let's get started. Before that, let me introduce myself. I am Achinta Zuru. I'm a senior software engineer at WSO2. You can follow me on social media on the following platforms and send me an email directly if you have any question about today's session. First of all, let's look at the problem with the current authentication mechanism. I think most of you have experienced a UX like this, right? Where a redirection occurs when you want to sign into an application. What is the issue with this? I think the issue is like stated here. The issue with this is it breaks the user experience of the application by redirection to the authorization server. So to solve this, Asgardeo has introduced application native authentication or app native authentication. In app-native authentication, unlike the current experience, user never leaves the application while logging in. It uses extended Auth 2.0 OpenID Connect flows in an API-centric way without redirecting to a browser. But currently, there's no industry standard for an experience like this. Hence, this is an in-house solution for now. In WSO2, we strive in creating the best experience for the developers. Therefore, we are creating a series of SDKs for developers to easily integrate app-native authentication into their application. And we have already released our Android SDK, and rest of the SDKs are on the way. So stay tuned for that as well. So as mentioned earlier, let's look at how to use this new Android SDK in your application. Don't get scared of this diagram. This is the actual overall architecture of the Asgardeo Android SDK, and it has 4 layers: provider layer, core config layer, core layer, and the data layer. So the provider layer has the functions that will call from the Android application. So basically the developer will interact with this layer and it has the necessary functionalities to do the authentication for them. And also the core config layer handles the call into the discovery endpoint if necessary. So in the Asgardeo Android SDK, we have given the developers freedom to enter the authorized endpoints and token endpoints manually, or enter the discovery endpoint directly. So the SDK will call that endpoint and retrieve those authorized and token endpoints. And that part will be handled by the core config layer. And core layer, this is where the main logic is. So here it will call the authorized endpoint and app native authentication endpoint and token endpoints to handle the authentication for you. And finally the data layer is basically in charge of handling and saving the tokens in the phone memory. Now let's get hands-on and do some coding. So today I'm going to follow this official documentation of the Asgardeo Android SDK to integrate this SDK to an sample Android application to show you how easy it is. So let's get to the demonstration.
So when you come to this mobile SDKs for Asgardeo documentation, you will see that 3 SDKs are listed. So iOS SDK and Flutter SDK are labeled as coming soon. So as I mentioned previously, so they will come soon. So stay tuned for that. And so for now, let's click on this Android SDK. And now you will see the requirements and recommendations and getting started steps on how to get started on the development with Asgardeo Android SDK. So to use this, you have to have these requirements complete. So the development of Android application should be done in Kotlin programming language, not Java. I mean, you can do with the Java, but it will be more difficult to integrate since this is written using Kotlin. And also the minimum support SDK is API level 26. And for some authenticators, it will require minimum API level as 34. So you can find those details in this documentation. I will not go into deep into that. Also, in the Asgardeo side, you will have to have this prerequisite completed. I hope you already have an account with Asgardeo and already have an organization created and already played around in Asgardeo. So I have listed on how to create an organization and stuff like basic stuff like that. But for this, you need to have a mobile application in the Asgardeo organization. When you create the mobile application, you will obtain a client ID from Asgardeo and you will need to embed that into the SDK integration part. Also note the redirect URI that you use to create the application. So it will also create in the integration part of the SDK as well. So I have already created the mobile application and now you need to enable the application native authentication. To do that, you can go to this advanced section and you can click this enable app native authentication API. And so I have already enabled it and then you can click update and it will update with the enable app native authentication API for this mobile application. So going back, now to install the Android SDK to your Android application, you need to have this command and paste it on the build Gradle file. And also to check the latest version, you can go to the Maven repository and check the latest version. So the current latest version is 0.1.3. So I can directly copy it from here. I have already whipped up a small sample Android application for this demonstration. So now you can like simply paste it here in the dependencies. I hope you are familiar with this stuff. I'm not going into details. And also after that, you need to add these values to the manifest, or you can simply paste it on the build Gradle file as well. So the installing part is now completed. Now, going back to these values, the callback URI host and callback URI scheme is related to redirection authentication mechanism, and the details are here, so you can check on that later. But for now, we require this appauth redirect scheme. So it is the URL scheme of your application deep link you add as the redirect URI. So for my application, this WSO2 API or sample Android. So I have put it as here. So now you can sync the application to install the SDK. Okay, while it is installing, let's go into the start the authentication process part. You need to create this Asgardeo auth object and it will require authentication core config object with the details of discovery endpoint and authentication endpoint, which is related to your organization detail. So you can find it in the info section. So for now, let's copy it directly and you can paste it on the main activity. For now, my org name is Achinta. I will copy the discovery endpoint here and paste this as Achinta. And also the redirect URI should be changed to this one. Also the client ID is cool. So now we have set up this Asgardeo auth object. Now, as I mentioned previously, you may remember the provider layer. So provider layer has two objects, with this authentication provider and the token provider. Authentication provider gives us the functions that are related to the authentication process. To do this, we need to initialize this authentication provider in our application. So let's do that. I think we need to import the class. So this authentication provider handles the authentication process using shared flow. So I'm not going into details on what shared flow is. It is a Kotlin concept. You can read more on the shared flow using this link. And it handles this authentication state using this authentication state object. And the authentication state has 4 states: initial, loading, unauthenticated, authenticated, and error. Sorry, 5 states. So initial means the initial state of the authentication process. Loading means is an SDK is calling an API to handle the authentication and waiting for the result. And unauthenticated means user is still not authenticated. And authenticated means like user is authenticated. And error means the error occurred during the authentication flow. So to start the authentication process, call this authentication provider this get authentication state flow. This will act as the observer for the authentication state changes.
After that, you can call this authentication provider is logged in state flow. This will check if there's an active session available, and if available, the authentication state will emit the authenticated state, else it will emit the initial state. And after that, you can call this initialize authentication to initialize the authentication process when the state is initial state. Okay, so there's a code sample here. So I will take some code snippets from here as well. So let's jump into the sample application. So we have now whipped up the sample application, and this is the main component that it will show. So we will require this authenticated state as well. Authenticated. Okay, and we will do this is authenticated. If authenticated, we will show the profile component, else it will show the login form component. Okay, so I will now use this is logged in state flow. To do that, we can directly copy this composable function and we can pass it from here. No, I will do like this, context, current context, and remove this direct, and I will put this as the variable. Okay, is logged in state flow is a suspend function, so you need to call it in a coroutine. So for this demonstration, I will use this global scope, but this is not the recommended way. I think you know this. So it's better to use another approach for this, like the view model scope or something. Okay, so now we will require to handle this authentication state, so we can collect this. Now we need to collect this authentication state. So do that, we can directly copy this launch defect function and we can paste it here. So it will call this initialize authentication if the state is initial, and if the state is unauthenticated, we need to set this is authenticated state value as false and is loading as false as well. And also, if authenticated, we need to set this is authenticated true and is loading false, and if it's loading, we will show like this. Now let's run this application and to see how this application show on the emulator. So it should show the login form first. Yes, because the application is not authenticated. Now let's integrate the other sections of the Android SDK. So now to do this, we need to fill the logic of this login form. So to do that, we can directly use this one in the login form and paste it here. So we do not need this part. And so the authentication flow, and so if you study the API response of the app native authentication, you will see that the next step, the authenticators that are required in the next step is coming in an array. So we can dynamically call like this, or if you know the authenticators that are coming, you can directly use that component, sorry, the composable function as well to show the authenticator. So for now I do not require this TOTP. So this example is to only to show how to dynamically capture the authenticators that are coming from the API response. So I'll remove this one. So we have whipped up this basic auth. So let's pass this authenticator value. Authenticator, and to authenticate with basic authentication or username and password, you can directly call this authentication provider dot username and password. So it is also a suspend function, so you need to call it in a coroutine. So let's copy this one and paste it here. So you need the context. Okay. So there's an error here. Yeah, we need the authentication provider. We need the authentication flow. So the authentication flow should be captured in the unauthenticated state. For that we can use the state variable for this as well. Cool. Now okay, so let's pass this authentication flow, and it will require the authentication provider as well. Cool. So require the authentication provider. Nice. So let's run this application now. We can see the login form. Now we should be able to log in with the user using the username and password. So I have already created the user in Asgardeo. So if you do not know how to create a user in Asgardeo, you can follow Asgardeo documentation. So user is James, password is James at 123. Yeah, so we can see the loading profile section is whipped up. So user is correctly authenticated. So since we haven't wrote the logic for the profile composable function, it will show as the loading profile, because he sees that if the username is empty or access token is empty, show the loading profile. So let's now see how to get this user profile information to your Android application. To do that, you can go to this get user details section, and you can use this basic user info function for that. So you can copy that one, and we can like write launch defect, so we need the key for this one, authentication provider, require the authentication provider, and we will require the context as well. So the profile section, So we can like directly use this and set the username as user details get, and this should be a nullable access token. And for now, so yeah, so user details is coming in a linked hash map as mentioned here. So you can like get the value, get the attributes of the user by using this get function. So let's like restart the application now. Yeah, so there's an error, we need to pass this authentication provider. So let's restart the application, and you should see the profile information. Yes, so the username is at james@wsoto.com. So I forgot to mention, to get the username, you should enable this username attribute in the user attribute section. So you can like directly search this username field, and you can get this username, and you can paste it here, and after that you should update it as well. So that's how you get an attribute to the user info object. So that's a separate thing. So you can see that access token is returning null because the token information is coming in a different endpoint and it's not coming in the user info endpoint. So this get basic user info calls the user info endpoint to get the user information, and the access token is not coming from that. So that's true, right? So how do you call this token endpoint? To call the token endpoint, you require the token provider. So the token provider, you can get it from this Asgardeo auth object as well. So let's get that token provider. And you need to pass it to the profile component as well. So token provider, and you can see to how to get the token information from here. Get token information. You can see that this get access token. So not all that, these all are suspend functions, so you need to call them in a coroutine as well. So you can get the access token, ID token, refresh token, access token, expires time, and swaps in the token endpoint. So let's get the access token, launched effect, and the key value should be token provider. Yes, get access token, and access token should be set, this should be a string. Yes, and let's put it as here. Okay, now if we reload the application, you should see the access token as well. Access token is returning now. Why is that? Okay, so we have like set the access token in the first launch effect, so let's remove this one. Yeah, access token is coming as expected. So that's how you get the token information as well. Now how to log out? So to log out, you can directly call this authentication provide.logout. Simple as it is. Let's put this in this on logout click. Launch and authentication provider logout context. So let's try the logout. So you can see that the user has successfully logged out. So that's the basics on how to integrate the Asgardeo Android SDK to Android application. Also there are some advanced concepts like client authentication, and also in here you can see how to authenticate with other authentication mechanisms like passkeys, DOTP, Google, there's redirect base, and all the OpenID Connect, Microsoft, everything. And there's a section on how to handle errors in the Asgardeo Android SDK, and also the best practices and the APIs of the Android SDK as well. So that's it for the demo. So let's go back to the presentation. So I hope you got the basic idea of how to integrate Asgardeo Android SDK to your Android application to use app native authentication. So let's take a quick recap and finalize the today's session. So we discussed on the problem we are trying to solve using app native authentication and what is app native authentication is, and we discussed the architecture of the Asgardeo Android SDK, and we did a demo on the Asgardeo Android SDK. And in the demo we discussed on how to install the SDK and how to handle this authentication state and how to authenticate with username and password and how to retrieve profile and token information. Also, a comprehensive demo is also attached in the description, so where you can see how it will look if we use other authentication mechanisms such as passkeys and Google sign-in. So that's it for today's session. Thank you for watching, and also make sure to like, share, comment and subscribe for WSO2 for more such content.